I would like to start this session with the Minister for Development. Thank you very much for making the time to be with us here today. This is our final session on Nutrition for Growth. It's something that this committee really cares about a lot. We've taken evidence over both the last Parliament and this one, so we're going to be giving you a lot of quick-fire questions to try and get information out of you. I wonder, do you want to introduce the team that you brought with you as well, please, Minister?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. I've got Jen Haugen and Chris Carter, who are both working at senior level on nutrition in FCDO. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you very much indeed for having me, Chair, and do tell me if I'm going on for too long. So I know you've said that this needs to be quick fire.
Thank you very, very much. First question is with Monica.
Hello, Minister, and welcome. Can I start off with asking you how your government will differ from the last in its approach towards achieving the second Sustainable Development Goal on zero hunger?
Yeah, so we think that we do need to shift our approach in response to our partners in the Global South and their concerns around nutrition and food security. First of all, we think we have to push hard for reform and shifting in international systems on this so that we have more effective investment where it's actually needed. We talked about this in the last session, but that has to apply when it covers nutrition and food security as well. That means the reform agenda that we've been pushing with the multilateral development banks and other parts of the international finance architecture, much more of a focus on, for example, smaller agri-food businesses and actually getting that support where it's needed. Secondly, we believe we've got to respond to countries' own plans around this agenda. For example, the Kampala Declaration is one that we strongly support and working with countries around that, African nations, in relation to that 10-year plan to deliver greater food security. We think this is very important when it comes to humanitarian support as well, and I won't go into that, but hopefully you've seen obviously the commitments that we've made as a new government, which have been seeking to really shift the dial in a number of areas of humanitarian need. And also we're really seeking to drive that change when it comes to integrating nutrition with climate, having a strong focus on adaptation, and I'm sure we'll get onto this in more of the questions, but I've seen for myself how important that is, and we're seeking to drive that forward.
Brilliant, thank you. So the cuts to UK aid in 2021 disproportionately impacted nutrition. Can you lay out how you're going to either return to the levels that it was before or the proportion of ODA that it's spent on nutrition?
Yeah, so those cuts were damaging, particularly, of course, because they were also unplanned. This was a chaotic period, and the previous international development Minister is on the record as saying, for example, that they led to food being taken off the plates of children in Yemen. That was his exact words. So this had a direct impact on that programming. We're determined not to see a return to that chaos, to have a much longer term approach. Of course, as you know, we have the 1-year SR, and we talked about that in the previous session. We've now got the multi-year spending review coming up, and we're looking at our programming and spending covering nutrition, but covering other areas as well. And key for me is going to be joining this up, actually, and making sure that we have a focus on nutrition where it's needed, because it applies in so many other areas as well.
Thank you, Minister. And to sort of follow up from that, how do you plan to engage with philanthropic organisations to sort of maximise, well, where your money can go?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point, and I think there are obviously philanthropic organisations that have different forms of expertise on this agenda. I had a really useful discussion with Bill Gates around this. Clearly, he's been doing in his foundation a lot of work around climate resilience, new, for example, animal husbandry as well, and vaccination and so forth. And certainly the UK has done quite a lot of work with him previously, and we've announced additional work since that meeting. So we're seeking to use those partnerships as part of that overall approach to making sure that we're working directly with Global South countries, as we talked about before.
And specifically on nutrition, you'd be open to that?
I would be, if it is in line with that approach of long-term partnership, where we're really focused on what countries and communities say themselves they need, in order to drive this forward. That means having a sustainable approach that's embedded in local communities, where we move away from perhaps a kind of, for want of a better metaphor, helicopter-style approach, instead something that's really embedded in local communities and economies. That's what would be important for me.
Thank you very much. David Mundell.
Thank you, Minister. Achieving SDG 2 is looking increasingly unlikely by 2030. So how is the government going to lead on renewing global progress towards that goal?
Well, thanks so much for raising this, and I think it is really worrying to see quite how far off we are from SDG 2. 750 million people now are going hungry, and that's 1 in 5 people living in Africa at the moment, so we're clearly far off. We have to be working with other countries on this. Of course, we've got some key moments coming up. I'm sure the committee will want to ask me about the big Paris Financing for Nutrition conference that's coming up soon, but there are many other areas as well where we need to make sure that we're continuing to focus on nutrition. That includes, as I said, around climate finance, of course, more generally financing for development, the Seville conference coming up, and really seeking to work directly, as I said before, with our partners in the Global South on this.
Well, you preempted me because I did want to ask you about the Nutrition for Growth Summit and whether you had indicated when you were previously here that you hoped you might be able to attend, and I wonder whether you're able to confirm that or whether the Foreign Secretary might be attending, and if you do, what are your preparations, and do you in fact intend to make a pledge at that summit?
Yeah, so I'm really delighted to say to the committee that barring any kind of mishap, which I hope will not happen, I will definitely be at that summit. I'm really looking forward to it. I know it's going to be a really important one. I know the committee had a discussion with Briac Pont about this previously as the French Special Envoy for Nutrition. And we are indeed working right now on our approach to that summit. We are, I can tell the committee now, considering setting a target for integrating nutrition objectives across CDO's ODA portfolio, so that we can have a maximum impact on tackling particularly malnutrition through all of our programming. We want to encourage others to do the same as well, so we're working on exactly how we're going to be delivering that at the Nutrition for Growth conference right now.
And does that mean a specific pledge when you're at the summit?
So that means that we're working towards setting a target for integration. In terms of whether we would be setting aside a specific figure of ODA for that purpose for the future, we will not be doing that. We obviously won't be through the spending review by that point, but we are determined that we make progress across all of our programmes on this agenda. And I know that issue of integration has been really important for the previous committee before the election. It's something that's been highlighted as missing from the SCDO's approach. So we're determined to try and lead on that and hopefully bring some other countries in with us.
But essentially that means no new money.
Well, the spending review will be looking at whether there will be new money, continuing money or reduced money across the whole gamut of different options. But we're very well aware that the UK needs to make sure that we are supporting communities in food insecurity, that we're building resilience for the future for communities, and above all working in partnership on this agenda.
Minister, if I can just push you a little bit. I'm hearing what you're saying. Absolutely it should be integrated. As I would say, things like WASH should be across all the programmes that we're doing in gender equality. But sometimes you do need specific project funding for nutrition. So is this an either-or situation, or do you see the potential to have both spending review taken into consideration?
Yeah, I don't think it is a situation where ensuring there's integration should reduce a specific focus on nutrition. I'm pleased that we co-founded as the UK the Child Nutrition Fund. Obviously that's really specifically focused on measures around nutrition and nutrition-specific supplies. That may be something we might come back to later. But clearly in many contexts that is going to be very important, also in relation to our humanitarian programming, of course, as we talked about before. But I do think that integration point is critical too, because there are very few areas really that the department works on where we can't consider nutrition also as part of the picture. And, yeah.
Can I bring James in, and then I've got Monica briefly, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to ask, given the warm words you're making around nutrition, I don't believe there's been an updated strategy since 2017. Is there a commitment to updating our nutrition strategy through the FCDO?
So we have been determined to make sure that we've got coherence around our approach to nutrition. Certainly since I came in over the last 6 months, that's been really important for the department. That started off with our commitment in Rio, and really pleased that I've got Jen and Chris here, because they were working hard on this with other officials. That commitment to the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which was one of the first things that I was involved with as a new minister. So we are seeking to make sure that we've got coherence. Obviously, always that we have an updated approach and one that is fit for the future. And I think with that integrated lens, this is going to be fundamental as we're seeking to develop longer term partnerships with key global south countries as well into the future. So I don't view this as, I suppose, a separate track of work from the rest of the body of what we're doing in ODA programming within the FCDO.
Thank you. Monica, briefly.
Minister, so previous commitments to global nutrition include ring-fencing interventions such as MMF and ready-to-use therapeutic food to treat children and for maternal health. So would you look at bringing back those ring-fence specific funding commitments to nutrition programmes?
Yeah, I mean, I think always with ring-fenced funding, there are challenges because it obviously reduces flexibility. It can, however, be important. It can be an important signal as well to others. It can hopefully crowd in other countries to adopt similar approaches, and it can send a signal, across the whole system that, a certain outcome is really important. I think on this issue, we really are determined to make sure when it comes to the most food insecure situations, that we are exercising leadership, that we're working with the World Food Programme and others, and UNICEF and others, to make sure that those specific supplies for children are available. And that was, of course, really important when the Prime Minister announced that he would be supporting the UN initiative against child wasting, that we would be seeking to play a leadership role on that. But that hasn't involved ring fencing so far. It's much more about making sure that we are really focused on this in those interventions for the most food insecure people, particularly children.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Brian.
Thank you. Minister, how will you measure the contribution your department's climate and conflict stabilisation programme makes to improve food security and nutrition outcomes?
Yeah, so we, with every programme, and we got a little bit into this, of course we'll be having more of a discussion about value for money, etc., with the committee in a wee while. But with every such programme, we would be seeking to look at the outcomes of it. Now, that would include in relation to nutrition. I have to say, in relation to our agricultural programming, and we may come back to this later, that actually so much of the climate adaptation related work is also producing more nutritious diets, because so much of it is about diversification. And I won't go on about this because of the chair's injunction to be brief, but I saw this myself in Zambia around the reform that we've been working with the Zambian government on, where previously it was kind of mono-species. Every farmer got a sack of maize and a bag of fertiliser every year. We help support reforms which have saved that government loads of money, but which has enabled farmers to diversify, to buy a whole range of different seeds that are both more climate resilient, but they're also more nutritious, because there's that broader category of foodstuff that people can actually use to feed themselves.
Okay, and leading on, you mentioned impact of value for money framework. Do you currently have an impact or value for money framework for SDG 2, or is that something that's coming?
So that wouldn't be separate from the overall work on value for money, which is both kind of ex ante at the stage of the development of kind of concepts and then business proposals, business cases, and then the process of assessment while programmes are ongoing, and then the ex post assessment as well. I am seeking to ensure that we do a much better job at pulling together the work of the department, that we've got much more clarity, certainly for myself as a minister, but more broadly around where we are achieving particular outcomes. That's ongoing work within the department. I'm sure I'll speak with the committee about at some other point. But there wouldn't be a separate regime apply for value for money for different SDGs.
Right. And what progress has been made in tracking food security outcomes across UK government programming?
So I would say much of that work would be, and I know the committee would be well aware of this, but it would be context dependent. I mean, clearly within situations of severe humanitarian need, we'd be working with partners around this. That work, and we may come back to this, that work obviously very upsettingly and frustratingly in Sudan has got harder because they've not been willing to allow the famine assessment to be taking place into the future. But in other contexts, that assessment would be part of the overall approach to the programme, whichever one it is. I mean, for example, again, when I was in Zambia, I saw work related to the health and nutrition of babies and their mothers, and there was a thorough assessment going into whether this had actually resulted in better health outcomes for those children and their parents or not.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Minister. Just going back to a quick point you made around climate financing and adaptation, I think currently it's 2% of climate finance goes to small-scale food producers. So has the UK government got a target to move that upwards in terms of our contributions to climate finance, or pushing other partners to kind of scale the percentage up that is going to the small-scale farmers?
Yeah, so that has been a big part of the kind of reform that we've been pushing as a new government. And we find too often with climate finance that the funds may actually be there, but they're very inaccessible for needs. And actually, where we see a greater focus on making these funds more readily available, more tailored to the needs of countries, then you tend to see more of them then passing through into smaller agribusiness, for example, actually being able to be accessed by smallholders in particular. I know that's been a particular concern of the committee and that you had some hearings with them. So we don't have a direct target for UK spending on this, but given our focus on adaptation particularly and our reform agenda, it has been really critical for us.
Thank you. Noah.
Do you measure the impact of your hunger-related programmes on people with disabilities?
Yes, that we are determined to ensure that we are having an impact, a positive impact on disabled people, and often they will be at the sharp end of food insecurity for a variety of different reasons. We are going to ensure that these issues are part of our disability inclusion and rights strategy. I know that's something that the committee's been interested in before. We're working on that at pace with Minister Timms, and obviously we've got the Global Disability Summit coming up in Berlin. We need to make sure that it's updated, that it covers issues like this as well. And there are kind of specific examples of good practice that I could draw on here. I would just say, though, also when it comes to measurement, that we're also encouraging others to make sure that support is getting to disabled people, and I certainly raised this with a number of UN agencies, for example, to try and make sure that they're seeking to support disabled people, including in food security.
We've talked in the past about cross-departmental working, also your role in women and equalities. Can you perhaps just elaborate a little bit more on how that collaboration works with Minister Timms' department?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do work really closely together. We have now lead ministers for disabled people in every government department, and we meet together and talk about the policies that we're trying to put in place where we're trying to achieve that change for disabled people. For the SEDO specifically, we are, as I mentioned before, producing a refresh of that strategy. Those who were on the committee before will remember, there are lots of good commitments within that strategy, but it does, in our view, require updating for current circumstances. So myself and Minister Timms have been working on this, and as I said, we're going to be announcing that refresh strategy at the Global Disability Summit. That's the beginning of April in Berlin.
Minister, it really makes me happy to hear that it's been a failing for far, far too long. So thank you very much for leading on that work. I appreciate it. Laura.
Thank you, Minister. One of the tests for me of the impact of our nutrition programming is whether it's reaching those who are in the hardest to reach areas, whether they're geographically isolated or facing multiple intersecting vulnerabilities that make it hard for them to access programming. What measures are we taking to ensure that our programmes reach those people?
Yeah, well, we are working hard on this, and we created a new resilience fund, actually, which is focused particularly on fragile context to try and make sure that we are supporting in that way. That is quite flexible funding that's available to post to use to support in these kinds of circumstances. That is in addition to the work that we've undertaken on these matters in relation to the kind of major humanitarian crises that the committee may want to talk about individually, but I'm very happy to talk about them if that would be useful.
Thank you. And thinking of places that are hard to reach, I have to ask about Gaza almost a week after the effective ban on UNRWA, knowing that since the ceasefire, 60% of the food aid that's got into Gaza has been through UNRWA. What's your assessment of the situation there, and what are we doing to ensure that food aid is still reaching people in Gaza?
Yeah, we obviously saw after the announcement of the ceasefire a radical scaling up of the number of trucks that were going in, 600 trucks getting in rather than the far, far lower number that we'd seen previously. We've been clear, however, that there must be a resumption of commercial trucking commercial supplies into Gaza. That has to be part of that stabilisation. Of course, that is part of our overall commitment, which is to see a shift from phase 1 to phase 2 and eventually into a two-state solution. You mentioned UNRWA, and I think the committee is aware of our position that we believe that only UNRWA has got the scale and depth and indeed the mandate to be able to operate in Gaza as required. That obviously is relevant, as you mentioned, for food security, particularly for education and health. We would say it's even more relevant there, but clearly there is that knock-on impact on food security as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You spoke about a flexible fund that went out to post. Is that in a specific number of countries or all ODA eligible countries? How is that divided up?
So that's specifically focused on fragile contexts, trying to develop the resilience within those contexts. As the committee knows, unfortunately, we've seen the number of fragile and conflict-affected states increasing over time, and we do have, as a department, specific programmes that already operate in different contexts or that focus on different aspects of food security and other kind of core requirements for populations, but we felt there was a need for something that was available, that was more flexible, that could be drawn on in that sense.
Is that the, I always get the letters the wrong way around, the Integrated Defence Fund? Or is it separate from that?
No, it's not part of the ISF, the Integrated Security Fund.
Security Fund, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a separate pot of money.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Alice. Oh, sorry, Monica.
Can I just Minister, do you have an update on UNRWA that you could share with us? Do you have an update on UNRWA that you could share?
On UNRWA? Well, I've been in discussion with Tom Fletcher, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, around the planning overall of the UN system around this. I'm sure that colleagues will also be aware of the government's general diplomacy in relation to what's taking place. We are seeing obviously a reduction in food insecurity compared with the situation previous to the ceasefire, but we want to see a much more sustainable approach for the future, obviously when it comes to food security, but also particularly water and sanitation, given the extent of destruction, healthcare and other services too. So we are working with other partners on this, and we've got a number of engagements over the next few weeks which are seeking to really try and work closely, as I said, with other countries and with the UN on these matters.
Thank you. Alice.
Thanks very much. A couple of questions on kind of global coordination and then coordination within FCDO. I will confess I worked on this in my previous life, but in March 2024 there was 27 World Food Prize laureates who called for a global plan to tackle the hunger crisis, because of a feeling that there are so many different initiatives. We've heard so many today, you know, there's Nutrition for Growth, there's Global Hunger Alliance, which are all welcome, but to me it doesn't feel that sometimes they all join up into holistic plans. So do you think we're missing something internationally when it comes to the global plan to tackle hunger?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, clearly we have the kind of key moments to try and focus the world's attention on nutrition and food security, and clearly the Paris Summit is going to be very important in that regard. But I have to praise Brazil's leadership actually on this, because I think the Global Alliance was a really significant measure, obviously using the G20 and their presidency of it to try and push forward change. I'm really delighted that the UK is on the so-called board of champions for that initiative, and that we've been particularly involved with policy sprints in relation to it. I think that was a good example of kind of partnership working across countries, trying to identify, well, what's actually going to achieve a change here. Let's not try and create an entirely new structure that is overarching. Instead, let's focus on what we can do and push forward in a relatively short space of time. So one of the policy sprints that the UK has been involved in has been around social protection and its link to combating hunger and poverty. And, you know, I do think on this, I mean, Brazil obviously speak with authority, because one can see the shift that's taken place, the positive shift in improving food security within Brazil under President Lula's leadership. And I do think it's great that they've used that to try and push things forward.
And when it comes to the UK and the previous government, I mean, we've got a list of all the different strategies that had some reference to global food security and nutrition. I think there was a commitment to develop an eternal sustainable global food security strategic framework. Is that something that is continuing? What's your go-to strategy or policy within FCDO to make sure this work is being coordinated effectively?
Yeah, I think this does boil down to that point around integration that we're seeking to push forward at the Paris Summit, because unless we make sure that we're sensitive to nutrition, and yes, that there is the specific focus where it's needed, but we will end up then, I think, with some of these matters not being properly integrated into programming, and potentially even with the situation moving backwards. One of the most kind of disturbing things I remember from Rio actually was seeing overall graphs of improvements across many parts of Asia when it came to nutrition, but then seeing, for example, in India amongst many women, that it was actually getting worse for a variety of reasons to do with access to protein and other things as well. So that integration kind of mindset, I would say, rather than like another bit of paper with the word strategy written on it, I think is going to be very important. And certainly since I came in, and I won't go on about this given the chair's injunction to be speedy, but in the different visits that I've undertaken, I have been able to focus on nutrition-related interventions and what we're really doing to try and push this forward. You know, whether that's in relation to forest governance, for example, how nutrition's part of that, as well as economic growth by seeking to develop forest products and improve population health, or many other contexts.
And just one final question, if I may. So in terms of like, if you're an NGO or someone external looking to track how the Foreign Office under this new government is progressing on this agenda, where would you be looking to see what the metrics are?
Well, you could look at tracker, isn't it? Yes, which has become my best friend, which I know the committee is very interested in. I mean, I think that is a great resource. I want it to become even greater, actually, so it's much easier to find information about programming. I think also they'll be able to look to that summit coming up and what we're going to be saying there. But I think for me, one of the most important things is obviously what the UK does directly, but what we can support others to do, and really how we can push that reform globally, working particularly with our Global South partners. And I mentioned before the Kampala Declaration, work in particular with African nations around this, I think is going to be really important.
Thank you. Minister, we love Dev Tracker too, but under the last government it tended not to be updated that frequently. So if there's any way that you can sort of keep your momentum going so that we do get it timely updated. And also, I know you're really across your brief on this, so if you do want to write to us on anything, that would be fantastic as well. James, did you want to come in?
It was just a very quick one, which is, in our notes it says here that the UN Environment Programme found that the UK scored only 41 out of 80 for policy coherence on SDG governance. So you mentioned the word coherence earlier, and we need things like nutrition to be cross-cutting. So what work's being done to make sure that our scores from an external perspective are improving?
Yeah, well, that will be important, and of course there is going to be an external report on our commitments made at the Nutrition for Growth Summit as well. So my view is that the more accountability we have around this, actually, the better, so that we can seek to be really ensuring that UK interventions on this are delivering and that we are seeing that that integration. So I think obviously it's been helpful to understand the assessment of other bodies, and we need to make sure that we're really, if at all possible, moving in a positive direction in the future. Yeah.
Thank you very much. David Taylor.
Hi, Minister. Thank you for coming in again. I am now turning to sort of questions related to how SDG 2 relates to some of our broader policies around trade, and then Alice's question around debt. So there's two questions on trade specific. Firstly, have assessments been made about the potential impacts of UK trade agreements on food security in low-income countries?
Yeah, so there are impact assessments for new free trade agreements. They are publicly available. The assessment that's been made of them by the Independent Regulatory Policy Committee is that they're rated as green, so they're deemed fit for purpose, and that's included an assessment of their overall global impact. We are working as a new government on how we ensure that we can both pursue UK domestic interests and supporting developing countries as well, so that we can harness trade for long-term development in particular. And this is an agenda that obviously I'm seeking to work on with the Department for Business and Trade. Obviously we're in a different context around many of these questions than we were, for example, pre-Brexit, and we need to make sure that we have an integrated approach.
Thank you. And just to change its tune slightly, smallholder farmers we've talked about a bit already, and I know that the SDDO provide some funding to help smallholder farmers, recognising that they have a role to play in food security, particularly within their own countries and maybe regionally as well. But partly because, of course, my background working the Fair Trade Foundation, one of the things that I did observe was that there wasn't much support really going to smallholder farmers that were exporting to the UK, not beyond BII. And there is quite a large proportion of those farmers that actually themselves have food insecurity because they're not getting enough money for the goods, the tea, the coffee, bananas and so on. So just wondered if there's any sort of reflections on that point, because it strikes me we have a sort of special obligation to help farmers that are exporting products to our markets who themselves can't actually afford to eat.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think there is activity from the UK government that is pushing in a positive direction on this. I would say particularly, I noticed this when I was in Malawi. It's really interesting, some of the discussions there, and particularly comparing that with the readout from your meetings as a committee with smallholder farmers. there's a big debate going on in Malawi around the kind of appropriate scale of farms and whether there should be more consolidation, how they could work with larger farms and so forth. But one key problem is, just as was mentioned, that they're in a huge bind on foreign exchange, which the government is working really hard to try and deal with in Malawi. And so increasing exports is obviously an enormous priority, even aside from the impact on individual smallholder farmers and living standards more generally. So we've been specifically supporting macadamia exports and mango exports, also supporting mining. Yes, 3Ms. I don't know exactly why it's ended up like that. Slightly weird coincidence, but that has been really quite important in seeking to enable that kind of foreign exchange resource, and I think that is critical for so many countries, as well as, of course, the impact on farmers' own food security and living standards that you've rightly mentioned.
Thank you, David Reid.
Chair. Thank you, Minister. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just do a few quick fire questions on SCDO internal capacity. So, having the right specialists in the department will be important. So how is the SCDO attracting and retaining the specialists it needs to contribute meaningfully to the SDG2 goals?
Yes, it's a very good question. Of course, the review of development that's been undertaken by Minister Shafiq that we talked about previously in the committee, it focused specifically on capability and capacity within the department. There is a food and agriculture professional cadre that is 45 technical experts working specifically on these issues for the UK government and across the globe, and I've seen that in action with a number of the visits that I've undertaken, and they really are absolute experts in their field. I think we need to make sure that we have got that expertise, but also that we're flexible enough to be able to work with others on this agenda. And of course, we've got some amazing UK research institutes, for example, in the UK, a number of them in the central belt of Scotland, but also in Norwich and elsewhere. And they really are important, I think, for the department as that source of expertise, as well as the in-house expertise as well.
Thank you. And just on that point, the Minoosh reports, can we have an update, please? And will it be shared with the committee?
So, as I said previously, I'm really happy to have a session with the committee to talk about the review and go through the core lessons from it. It'd be great to work with you all on this, so I agreed to that at the last session.
But the report itself won't be shared with us?
Well, it was a report to the Foreign Secretary, as with all of the different reviews. Quite a lot of it is quite technical, focused specifically on those development capability and capacity issues, which I know the committee is really concerned about, but it goes into a huge amount of detail on them. I know, however, you, like me, really want to see change on this, that you want to see a boosting of that capability and capacity and a restoration of the UK's reputation on international development. So it'll be really good to speak about this with yourselves soon.
So just to confirm, it won't be shared with us?
So, David, rather than going down that route, Minister, if you are able to share a copy with us, even if it's in a read-only capacity, that would be deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we agreed that I would have a discussion about it, that we would make sure that we're sharing the core findings of it with yourselves. So we are seeking to take that forward.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And then just last question.
Sorry, do you know when we can expect that?
As soon as I can. I'm sorry that I don't have a precise timescale, but I know the committee is really interested in this. So
Thank you very much. David?
And then just last question. So the last government informed the committee that there would be a recruitment round for technical specialists in this area in 2024. Has this taken place yet?
So I have to say I don't know whether previous government commitments around recruitment in this area have been fulfilled. I know that more broadly around capability and capacity, when I came into role as Minister, I worked with officials to ensure that we did have a programme to increase our capability and capacity, and that's included a recruitment programme for a large number of staff, particularly focused on areas where we needed to buttress our expertise. Some of that was around fragile and conflict-affected states, and I would have expected that would have related to some of the issues we're talking about. But a kind of specific commitment from the previous government, I'm not sure. I won't be unfair about this, but there were quite a number of commitments without always a plan to deliver them, and I don't know if that fell into that category or not. Yeah.
Thank you. Sam?
Thank you. two questions. The first is just about when centrally managed programmes, the degree to which centrally managed programmes are making use of the knowledge of in-country staff and what you're doing to ensure that that knowledge is being shared.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally there is sharing of knowledge, but that there's always more that can be done. When I was in Indonesia, I visited a forestry management programme that involved elements which were both based in country and from centrally managed programmes too. And I felt it was a really good example actually of bringing together the kind of broader expertise with that in-country knowledge, because of course, you know, every social system is going to be different, every political system is going to be different as well, the context also for the local economy is going to be different. Certainly I think, you know, in many places there is that integration, but there's always more that can be done, and certainly as Minister I'm keen to ensure that we're as joined up as possible so that we really make sure that we're targeted in our interventions. But I would say also, on top of the centrally managed programmes, we need to make sure there's integration with multilateral activities too, whether that's the World Bank or, you know, other UN agencies.
Thank you. And I also wanted to ask, it's a slight departure from nutrition, but nutrition has a close relationship with immunisation as well, because we know that that children who are not immunised are more susceptible to disease, but also children who are malnourished are more susceptible to disease. There's concern, I think, in the donor community about the replenishment of Gavi, and the understanding seems to be that the government can't commit until after the spending review, and yet the replenishment round is in March. And obviously countries around the world are looking to the UK to see what we do. And so there's a real danger that if we don't commit in March, neither will other countries, particularly Middle Eastern countries where we may be able to exercise some leverage, and that we could then roll back on years of progress fighting and eradicating infectious diseases. Speak to that.
Yeah, of course. So we're really determined that there must be successful replenishments, whether we're talking about Gavi or indeed the Global Fund as well. There's a number of replenishments that are coming up. When we're talking about multi-year commitments, you know, of course we have to consider the context with the spending review. It would not be appropriate for me to say that we can ignore that. I don't think other departments would be happy with us saying that, and I'm not actually sure that the taxpayer would be happy with us saying that we weren't looking at these issues as a government in the round. But we are in discussion with Gavi, as we are with the other major health organisations looking towards replenishment at the moment. I believe I've got a meeting actually with the head of Gavi next week. That follows from other meetings that I've had with Dr. Sanya Nishtar, and I'm really looking forward to that, to talk about this, how the UK can support that process, but also, as was mentioned, how we can try and make sure that there's a broadening of the donor base. I know that Gavi's been doing a lot of work around that themselves, and we're keen to work with them on it.
But with other departments, I think there's an assumption that budgets will stay more or less the same until the spending review. But are we in a position with Gavi where we'll be walking into that meeting in March unable to commit any funding? With respect, I don't think there is an assumption necessarily, so maybe I misunderstand the question, but I think there, in every department, is an assumption that there needs to be a really thorough review of budgets, that there needs to be indeed zero-based budgeting where possible, so that there can be that really thorough analysis about whether we're delivering best value for the taxpayer. And certainly I'm determined to achieve that as the Minister for Development, just as every other part of the new government will be determined to do as well. These issues around having proper fiscal competence that can be trusted, I think are really fundamental. They're important for our economy as well as for government. But where does that leave us in March?
Well, I just spelled it out to you. I can repeat it again if you like. We've been really clear that we want to see a successful replenishment of Gavi, as with the Global Fund. We've been working with Gavi on this. We're continuing to have those discussions. I'm aware that ultimately Gavi delivers good value for money for those who invest in it. You know, many pounds ultimately of benefit are realised for each individual pound of funding that goes into Gavi. Of course, the UK has been traditionally one of the biggest funders of Gavi, so we are working with them right now on their replenishment. But I can't pretend that the spending review doesn't exist, because it does.
Minister, we're hoping from what you've said that you're going to fight tooth and nail, because we were obviously one of the founders, and you're right, it's exceptionally good value for money. I've got 4 very brief questions from ministers. So David first.
Yeah, well, I'm obviously very much on side on both the Global Fund and Gavi, and anything that you can do in that regard is extremely welcome. I actually wanted to go back to the nutrition a part of the discussion, and just ask for you to say a bit more about how the department does work with the likes of the Roslin Institute, with Hugh, who the previous committee visited, and John Innes in Norwich, in terms of actually taking forward the development of more nutritious and affordable foodstuffs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that work has been really important. I would also mention the Perbright Lab as well, and I believe there's an Edinburgh-based initiative called GalvMed as well that's worked on livestock vaccines. This is clearly absolutely fundamental work that also does contribute to other government goals too. And so I was just thinking, while you were talking about that, we had a meeting this morning on global health, and of course actually that veterinary health is very much relevant for global health more broadly too. We're really clear that actually investment in those kinds of initiatives and that kind of research is not only important in the global south and in situations where there's food insecurity, it's also been really important for UK farmers as well. We were just looking previously at some of the figures for CGIAR and the UK's contribution in relation to that overall research programme, which many of these institutes, of course, are plugged into. And UK farmers gain between £1.60 and £2.40 in productivity benefits for every pound that the UK government invests. So this is cutting edge, UK focused activity, jobs within our own country, which is then leading to those really positive results globally, but then also with a positive for our UK-based farmers, because they're benefiting from that research too.
Thank you. Alice.
Thanks very much, and as a Norwich MP, very good to hear the tribute to John Innes Centre and all the work that they do. I just wanted to go back to the issue of debt, and the previous committee obviously found that is one of the most cost-effective things we can do as a government, debt cancellation. You've done a lot of work on this already. It'd be good to hear how specifically that will impact on nutrition. And one idea that has been pushed by people like President Joyce Banda, the former president of Malawi, is the idea of suspension for debt for countries that are at risk of backsliding on food and nutrition. And in a similar way that there are these debt suspension clauses around climate, having that on food security as well. And I just wondered if you've been thinking about anything specific around debt and food insecurity.
Yeah, so yesterday I set out a number of measures that we're seeking to take in relation to debt, and really called on particularly the private sector to be working with the UK on the take-up of majority voting provisions and other changes that we want to see, and we want other countries to be much more transparent in their lending as well as the UK is. But one element that I did mention was precisely, as you said, around climate resilient debt clauses. I know the committee will be aware of these. I'm really pleased that under the new government we supported the World Bank to be able to deliver that and to mainstream it through its lending, quite rightly. I know there have been calls to think about whether there could be a kind of broader debt holiday related to other forms of crisis that might impact on a country. We've been quite focused on climate resilient debt clauses because that's been the particularly strong call from people like Mia Motley, for example, and what she said was needed. Of course, we're looking carefully at all of this. I mean, I think the key thing for me is that while the nature of debt now may be different, in fact, we talked about this at the last hearing, while it may be different to that back in the 2000s, the impact of it is the same when it is reducing countries' domestic resources that they can use, whether it's to support nutrition or indeed health or education.
Thank you. Monica.
Thank you. Minister, many of us have noted with concern what's going on in America at the moment and the US aid. I'd be interested to know what your response is to that. What impact it will have on UK-funded programmes and our partnership with USAID, and reassurance from you that we will not be following, but we will hold steadfast in our provision of UK aid.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that question. As the committee would expect, we are currently working to assess the implications of the US funding pause across development sectors. I have to say to the committee, there's still a lot that is unclear, as you will have noted, I'm sure, as well. But we are actively gathering information. We're also carefully calibrating our engagement with the US and looking for opportunities to influence based on our shared objectives between the UK and the US. I know the committee will be aware that there was news that emergency food aid and life-saving humanitarian assistance should be exempt from the pause in US foreign aid. We're currently assessing the implications in other humanitarian sectors. And you asked rightly specifically about UK development activity. We're very clear about our priorities. We're clear about what we want to achieve through development, and I set that out in the previous session when we were together. We're really determined that we restore our development reputation, that we work in partnership with other countries, particularly Global South countries, and that will involve working with the United States, but it will also involve working with many other countries as well. And certainly I've been having a lot of discussion with a whole variety of different countries who are keen to be contributing to development, to humanitarian support, and that kind of engagement needs to continue into the future.
Minister, I think on that point, a number of committee members have colleagues who have been directly impacted, and it's a big concern for us. Do you know of any UK-led projects that have been compromised as a consequence of this at this point?
So, of course, we're assessing all of this currently. These decisions are decisions that have been taken, of course, by President Trump and his administration. He was elected by, of course, the US population, as we know, with millions of votes. And it is ultimately a US policy decision.
I'm not challenging his policy decision at this point. I might in the future. But what I'm saying is, have we got any UK projects that are now vulnerable because they've lost key staff members, for example?
Yeah, we're assessing this currently. I'm confident that our programmes are resilient programmes. Of course, whenever there's any change in development policy by a range of different countries, and we've seen many of them changing their approach over recent years, there will be an impact from that. But certainly from the UK's point of view, we're clear about our approach, we're clear about what we want to achieve, and that's not going to change.
Thank you. And the work is ongoing to see what that impact is.
Yes, absolutely, and I believe that's in common with every other country, and we're calibrating with our friends on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Final question to James.
Yes, thank you. Just a similar theme, really. I just want to know, obviously, this is a risk that maybe we were expecting. How long has the department been preparing for the announcement that came from America? Is that something that we've been working on for a period of time? And how long until you think you'll get to the point where you truly understand the impact?
Well, I don't think the committee will be surprised to hear me say that there was quite a large amount of trailing of different elements of President Trump's agenda before the election. Clearly the department was well aware of this, as with every other upcoming election, and we have a number of them, in fact, coming up, which may be of relevance to development issues. So, of course, this is looked at carefully, but at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, we need to be clear about what we want to achieve as the UK. I think that's really important. Of course, we are determined to keep working with the US. We've been talking about nutrition, for example. The US is traditionally a very significant contributor to food security in a number of different countries. I was in Ethiopia not so long ago. It's been a very significant provider of food aid there. Also, of course, in Sudan, other contexts too. And we will seek to continue to work with the US on this. and on other issues, and indeed with other countries, and be very clear about our objectives in doing so.
Minister, you've been very gracious with your time, and also with your experience. It makes our job easy to have a minister that's all over their brief. So thank you very much for that. We do really appreciate it. I think you have satisfied committee members, which is quite a tough challenge. So congratulations on that. Thank you again for your time, and thank you for your team as well. Order. This session is now.